Good afternoon, dear colleagues. My name is Stephen Freeland. Unfortunately, I can't join you in person for this wonderful conference that you're attending. But let me firstly extend my sincere congratulations to my dear friend, Dr. Iona Bratu, who does amazing things and has now established the Amsterdam Space Law and Sustainability Centre and has put together this wonderful event. I hope the discussions are going well. Dr. Bratu has asked me to spend a little time talking about sustainability in the context of the work that I have the honour of leading at UN COPOS. I'm recording this message just 2 or 3 days after the completion of the 64th session of the Legal Subcommittee of UN COPOS, which ended in the middle of May. And let me present a bit of an update about the work that's being done. I have the honour of being the chair of the Legal Subcommittee's working group on legal aspects of space resource activities. We've done a lot of work over the past few years. We're now at the point where we are drafting substantive principles about possible future space resource activities. And obviously, given the theme of this conference, it might be of interest to you if I refer to some of those issues that are involved in these principles, and particularly as they relate to the issues of sustainability. So let me share my screen, if I may. It's always the most difficult thing, but hopefully you can see my screen now. So I'll talk to you about how the multilateral process, that is UN COPOS, is being utilised to develop principles that look at future space resource activities through the lens of reaching consensus amongst all of the member states and taking into account all of the different types of issues and perspectives that are being raised in the discussions we're having. And many of these relate to issues around, as I say, sustainability. So from my perspective, let me just briefly outline to you about space resource activities and what's at stake. Given that I'm only, the timing issues here, I'll only spend a brief amount of time on these issues. But the notion of space resource activities, perhaps exploiting the natural resources on the moon and other celestial bodies, is not a new one. You're all aware, of course, that we already have a treaty in place, the 1979 Moon Agreement, which dealt specifically with establishing a legal regime when such exploitation activities are about to become feasible. Now, for a whole range of reasons, most of you would be aware that the Moon Agreement was not taken up by very many states, but it still is international law. And the 17 states parties to that agreement obviously would fiercely ensure that their rights are maintained and sustained and respected under that treaty. That said, one could argue that none of the major spacefaring nations, or perhaps better put, none of the spacefaring nations who are most likely to play a major role in future space resource activities, at least in the near to medium term, none of those are states parties to the Moon Agreement. And now we have a separate process, a much broader process through COPOS. The original notion of space resource activities was then rekindled in the around 2010 or so by a number of US entrepreneurial companies who put the argument that we could, and for my talk, I'll talk about the moon. We could go to the moon. We could extract rare earth or perhaps rare minerals. There are supposedly deposits of helium-3 which could be extracted, and we could bring them back to Earth and utilize them on Earth. Very quickly, it was calculated that, putting aside all of the technical challenges, and there are many of those, there's no economic case that would support that sort of activity. And so, in a sense, the focus of space resource activities, again, at least for the short to medium term, is we'll go to the moon, we will extract, perhaps the focus being water and the water ice. We'll utilize the water ice on the moon itself to create oxygen, to sustain life, and also through a processing to separate the hydrogen and the oxygen and convert that into fuel. And then the moon could be used, in one sense, as a refueling station for then deep space activities. That is the sort of activity and scope that is being contemplated, at least at this time. Of course, the notion of extracting anything from a celestial body raises a whole range of ethical considerations, of perspectives from a cultural perspective, from an indigenous perspective. It raises environmental issues, and obviously it gives rise to important considerations about how any such activities, if they are to take place, and it's still an if rather than a when, if they are to take place, should be done sustainably. And many argue, and you're seeing now these discussions coming up again and again with proposed mining in the deep seabed, which is now reaching a critical path in terms of interest as well. And again, the environmental issues and the ethical issues come up, particularly, as you know, given the legal framework that we have about space, it being an area that we all have a stake in, it being an area where there is no appropriation possible. So there are many considerations here. There's a lot at stake, and therefore we need to have a governance framework. The existing international law framework that we have, in particular on the treaty side, the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, and as I mentioned, the 1979 Moon Agreement, have a lot to say that will be relevant for future activities. The point being, however, that as the technology for such possible future activities develops, we need more in terms of governance instruments building upon the fundamental principles in those treaties as applicable, building upon them, but to create a greater certainty, a greater clarity, and to ensure that there are agreed rules of the road that would govern any such activities. So the treaties are helpful, but the international community feels it needs more. There are other non-binding instruments that have come from COPOS. You're aware of them, the Space Debris Mitigation Guidelines, the LTS guidelines. They have a bit to say that is relevant, but not entirely specific about the idea of in situ space resource activities on a celestial body. And then there are many who argue that we should look at other regimes, the ITU regime, which manages other types of natural resources and our use of them, in particular the radio frequencies on particular orbits, and of course the International Seabed Authority that looks at potential deep seabed mining. Are there lessons to be learned there? Are there ideas that might be relevant for the unique environment that is space? This is a conversation that takes place at many levels. You'll know, starting from the bottom of this slide, that civil society has been actively involved, many academics, many groups of academics, industry, NGOs have done a lot of work to try to present ideas about what a framework might look like. We have groups of countries For example, the Artemis Accords, which at the time that I'm recording this has 54 signatories, and the International Lunar Research Station, the ILRS program, led by China with Russia there as well, which currently has, I believe, about 13 member states that have signed onto it, plus many other organizations. So those conglomerate of countries, and in the ILRS case, also organizations, themselves are developing their own types of ideas about what a framework looks like. And then, of course, at the national level, a number of countries, starting with the 2015 USA legislation, which really galvanized the more recent discussion on this area. But a number of countries have developed national laws which purport to grant certain rights to their nationals who engage in such activities, typically, though, subject to the international framework. And it's the international framework that needs to be understood if we are to understand how to move forward. As a result, there's lots of words here on this slide, but really just to let you know that following that 2015 US legislation, as I said, the international community was galvanized. There was lots of reaction in the COPOS discussions. COPOS, through its legal subcommittee, decided to include every year now an agenda item dealing with potential legal models for what it termed the exploration, exploitation, and utilization of space resources. Various consultations were established, and then in 2021, a working group was established entitled the Working Group on Legal Aspects of Space Resource Activities, which has a clear mandate, a clear terms of work and reference. You can view all of that online at the dedicated webpage of the working group. We've met many, many times. I have the honor now to be the chair of that working group. And at the most recently concluded Legal Subcommittee, which took place, as I said, just a matter of days ago, I chaired in total 10 meetings of the 104 member states, and we progressed our work. I've highlighted there in yellow a point that we are now at. So as I mentioned before, the member states and through the working group, we've conducted an analysis that shows us that whilst the fundamental principles of the treaties do have a lot to say that is relevant, there are gaps. And those gaps should be filled with what the member states have termed initial recommended principles for space resource activity. In 2024, the member states mandated the Bureau, self and now my dear colleague, Ambassador Mishtal, who sadly has passed away, to do the first draft of those principles. I drafted those, I circulated those to the member states in March of 2025. They became public in late April in all of the UN languages, and at the LSC, we've started negotiating those principles in earnest. We will continue that work with a view, amongst other things, to agreeing these initial recommended principles by the conclusion of the mandate of the working group in 2027, and then potentially and hopefully to pass that on, these principles as a resolution to be passed by the United Nations General Assembly. So we've got lots of work to do, but we now have a hard set of draft principles that deal with these activities. Some of the issues that the member states have raised when it comes to what might be in these principles is shown on this screen here. This is an extract from the 2024 Legal Subcommittee report, the working group's report from that Legal Subcommittee meeting. Many of these issues were again revisited in our recently concluded discussions, but these issues, along with other written contributions that I received from many member states and some permanent observers, form the basis upon which the initial draft of these recommended principles is constituted. And you can see here there are some things that you would readily expect. For example, centrality of the Outer Space Treaty, international law, the applicability as appropriate of the other treaties, definitions. But then we have other things as well, like scientific research and economic development, how to balance those two, equitable aspects of space resource activities, looking at environmental issues, looking at economic issues, looking at ethical issues, looking at indigenous and intergenerational aspects, looking at how the private sector will be involved, the important issue of sharing of information, other issues, benefit sharing, developing countries and emerging spacefaring nations. You can see there's a wide range, I call it a box of marbles, of potential ideas and issues that should be in this initial set of recommended principles to complement the existing treaties, but to take them further. What else do we need in addition to the foundational principles that we have? So I prepared these the initial draft of these principles on the basis of contributions I've received. The initial draft, it's a public document. You can see at the bottom there, it's document A/AC.105/C.2/L339. There is the link to it. The initial draft comprises a preamble of 8 preambular paragraphs and then 10 principles. I've drafted those on the basis of what I garnered to be a common understanding amongst the working group states. And remember, the working group states is the 104 member states of COPOS. And remember also that any decision is required to be made by consensus. So in the end, when we agree these principles, they will be a consensus document through the multilateral process. Now, the draft principles, you can look at them by going to the reference, choose your language. It's in all of the official UN languages. We've now started negotiating some of these. The headings will change a bit. The preamble will change. We're now beginning to look at the substantive principles themselves. There's a lot of work to be done. We will have perhaps 3 or 4 intersessional meetings before next year's Legal Subcommittee. The states are positively engaged. There's been a tremendous feeling of constructiveness. All states are curious to see where this process will lead, remembering that in the end, we'll need consensus. So obviously, there's a lot of hard negotiations to be had. The principles that are in this initial draft deal with things that you would expect to see, but then I've drafted them in a way that sets it out in more detail. So you'll see the draft principles. You'll also see in the document that's at the reference on the slide a separate part, which I call part 2, which are possible additional terms to those principles that are not yet at the stage, as I perceive it, to be of a common understanding, but still may be negotiated and agreed. And there are many issues there that come from the different perspectives, from the Artemis states, from the ILRS states, from the parties to the Moon Agreement, some input perhaps also from civil society, etc. So there's a lot of work to be done. But the principles as they stand, they deal with issues like that are very relevant for the topic of this conference you're attending, sustainability. So clearly there's a general agreement that international law applies, that the Outer Space Treaty applies, that other treaties apply as applicable, and maybe some other governance instruments through COPOS may be helpful in that. And of course, there's an underpinning that looks at the way we engage in space activities for peaceful purposes, and that, of course, helps us in our goal to try to maintain sustainable uses of outer space. So we've got compliance with law, we've got a reinforcement of the peaceful purposes doctrine, of non-appropriation, of freedom of access, And then there's issues about safety. Clearly, safety is important, safety of operations, but more importantly, perhaps safety and health of human life. And of course, that has issues around protection of the environment. You'll see there, one of the principles is currently headed sustainability and protection of the environment of Earth and outer space. So clearly we have issues about how are we going to manage such activities in a sustainable way? How are we going to do it to minimize the environmental degradation, minimize contamination, minimize the generation of hazards, minimize phenomena or other things that might be impairing future activities or indeed impairing the safety of activities, minimizing the notion that as we move forward, we're creating more and more debris, because all of those issues will be relevant to determine whether, and this boils down to sustainability, of course, if we are to engage in such activities, we can do so to allow the current generation to engage in it, but not jeopardize future generations. And by future generations, of course, different people have different perspectives. But for example, in Australia, which is my home country, the notion of future generations from our First Nations people is not one or two, but 7+ generations. And if you start with that sort of thinking about intergenerational equity, that of course importantly impacts on the way that you might want to govern such activities in the future. And then of course, the sharing of information will be highly relevant for sustainability purposes, as well as some of the other issues. Notions of how we authorize and continually supervise, notions of responsibility, notion of other issues of responsibility, coordination, consultation, cooperation. All of these things are important. And of course, these principles, when they are agreed, will be just a first step. The document itself has to last the test of time, not 1 or 2 or 3 years, but 10, 20, 30 years. But of course, we need to continually look at it to see whether it needs to be updated and reviewed as technology moves forward, as activities move forward, as the types of cooperative ventures that are being put together by states and their corporates move forward. So there's a lot of work to be done. Sustainability is one of the underpinning issues that will be relevant for the way we govern future space resource activities. It's an important element in the even broader element about the sustainable use of outer space going forward, writ large. Of course, any activities on the moon and other celestial bodies by way of space resource activities constitutes a form of the exploration and use of outer space, and therefore, of course, all of those incredibly important issues that you're discussing at your conference today about sustainability will also be very relevant as we move forward. So this is, we're at a situation now where we are actually creating new types of governance instruments. It's not easy. As I said, consensus is required. That's difficult at the best of times, let alone in an area like space resources, which is so political and so sensitive, particularly given the geopolitical challenges we are in now. But rest assured, it is at the forefront of considerations, along with a whole range of other issues. So with that, let me thank you very much. Thank you again, Iona, for giving me the opportunity to address this conference. I'm so sorry I can't be there, but I wish you all well. I hope these brief comments have given you some insights. It's a work in progress, but we are making great progress. I'd be happy to hear from anyone. My email addresses are on the slide here. I'll stop sharing, and from Luxembourg, where I am at the moment recording this, let me again wish you a wonderful conference. I'm so sorry I can't be there, but I hope that we'll have the opportunity to all meet again in person at some stage. So with that remarks, I wish you well. I hope your conference goes well. And if you have any comments or suggestions or would like to reach out, I'd be very happy to hear. So with that, all the best from Luxembourg and have a great conference. Bye for now.